Hey there, Southridge Church. Welcome to Catalyst service tonight. We are moving forward in our Problem Child series, where we've been looking at the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church that he started in Corinth. And we've titled this series Problem Child because Corinth had a lot of issues going on. They had a lot of questions. They seemed to be getting it wrong in a couple different ways, more so than other churches. And so Paul's having to write them a corrective letter to kind of help them get back on track, get some answers to some questions that they needed, and to also to correct some really bad behavior and foul behavior happening in the church. So tonight we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Go ahead, grab a Bible, open it up on a tablet or something. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And as you get there, I want you to start thinking about, what is your favorite pizza place? What is your favorite place to get pizza from? I don't know about you, but one of the most difficult things for us as a family is to decide where to get pizza from. Because my kids and my wife, their favorite pizza is not my favorite pizza. In fact, their two favorite places to get pizza, Husson's and Geno's, are my two least favorite places to get pizza. I am a traditional, I like Pizza Hut, I like Papa John's. Those are the two. Like if we're just using the local big chains or whatever that we have in our area, those are the two. I want Pizza Hut, I want Papa John's, but they like Geno's and they like Husson's, and it's so hard for us to decide when it's pizza night where we're going to get pizza from. And so more often than not, though, they end up winning that conversation. They end up getting their way with the pizza. Because here's what I've come to know: when it comes to a family, when it comes to a group of people, it's normally better and easier to put others before yourself if you want things to go better. If you always have to have your way, if you always have to insist on your way, if you're not caring about the needs of others around you, it's probably not going to go really well for you long term. So more often than not, we eat Husson's, we eat Geno's, we eat whatever my wife and kids want. I put them first. And that's actually one of our core values here at Southridge Church. Is we say it like this: we before me. And we talk about how personal preference is something that you could have, when it comes to pizza and when it comes to Burger King. Yes, you can have it your way, but in the church, we can't always have it our way. We have to put the needs of others before ourselves. That's one of the things Paul's going to talk about tonight in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to talk about a topic that probably doesn't have a lot of significance on the surface to you and I because of the way the times have changed. But the overall overarching idea of what he's talking about is going to be super important for us as modern day followers of Jesus. So let's go now. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. This is the words the Apostle Paul wrote down. He said, "Now about food sacrificed to idols." So he gives us the introduction of what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. And remember, Paul is just addressing issues or questions that the Corinthian churches had and trying to help them out. So what most scholars will tell you is that what Paul's doing in this chapter is they had a question about whether or not it was permissible for Christians to eat meat that had been bought at the temple of different pagan idols and things like that. Let me explain the full situation. In the ancient world at this time, there was really two ways that you could go about purchasing meat. If you went to the market to get it, it was much more expensive. You could also go to local temples of local false gods and pagan gods, and you could buy the meat that they had used in their different sacrifices and different services and things to that god. You could go buy that meat, and it was much cheaper. Now, what was happening in the early Christian churches, there was a debate as to whether or not it was permissible to go and get that cheaper meat. Like if you were low on funds, was it okay to go get that meat and eat that meat? So Paul's going to answer that question. So he says, now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not know as they ought to know, but whoever loves God is known by God. Wait a second, I thought you said we were going to talk about eating food sacrificed to idols. Now why is he talking about knowledge and he's talking about love and all of this? Well, Paul's going to start this conversation out by going, listen, you may know some stuff on this topic. You may have some knowledge, you may have some insight, but we always have to remember that knowledge and insight must always be tempered by love for other people. So before we get into what Paul has to say about food sacrificed to idols, there's clearly some sort of conflict going on in the church surrounding this. And Paul's reminding everyone what we learned in chapter 1. We all, when it comes to being part of a church, when it comes to being part of a family, humility. Let them get Husson's Pizza when they want to get Husson's Pizza. Humility is going to always be the best route to take. And so he's telling them, you may know some stuff, but listen, your knowledge has to be tempered by love if it's truly going to be effective. And so we're going to go on here. He says this in verse 4. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. So here's what he's saying. He's saying, you have issues with eating meat sacrificed to these false gods. And he's like, I understand where you're coming from, but the stronger Christians in the Corinthian church, they knew something that the weaker, the newer Christians did not yet know. That if a God is a false God, and if you believe that there's only one true God, which is what the Christians believe, there's one true God, and someone sacrifices meat to a false God, well, something that's false, something that doesn't actually exist, can't actually contaminate that meat. They're thinking logically. They're like, listen, if I serve the one true God and you say that you sacrifice this to another God, well, really, you're not doing anything that would contaminate that meat. You're not doing anything that should be a problem for me in my faith. That's what the more mature, wise Christians are saying. They're saying, that's not a real God, and so you're not really sacrificing it to anything. It would be like me saying I sacrificed, a chicken to, to my imaginary friend. Like, it doesn't exist, so why are we so caught up on it? But the weaker Christians, the newer Christians in the church were really struggling with this. They hadn't grown yet in their Christian liberty to feel good about partaking in the cheaper meat from the temple. And so you had this, like when they would come together for the church potluck, when they would come together in people's homes, there were some that felt okay about it, there were some that didn't. And Paul here, he's just telling us, like, first and foremost, we know logically that meat sacrificed to a false god, really it can't be contaminated because that God doesn't exist anyways. And that's where this idea of knowledge being tempered by love comes in, because the logical thing to say is, well, it's cheaper to buy that meat, and that meat can't be untainted by a God that doesn't even exist, so let's just go eat the cheaper meat. That's the logical way of looking at it. But the way that the problem with logic, and this is what happens so much on your social media feeds. This is what happens if a conversation that you're having doesn't end up going really well. Most likely it's because you're leaning on logic, you're leaning on knowledge, but you're not thinking about love in that moment. You're not thinking about, how do I present this argument in a way that is both logically correct, but also loving? And so many people in our culture, when we go out, we just spout stuff off online. We want to be right, we want to be logical, and we don't care if we're loving, because we think it's more important to be right than loving. I'd say it's every bit as important to be loving as it is right. In fact, you need both. I'm not saying that you can just be loving and not be right. Don't get me wrong. Truth is truth. But you have to have both. In fact, this is the model Jesus gave us. When John, the Apostle John, writes his gospel about Jesus in John chapter 1, verse 14, he says that he came full of grace and truth, which means he came full of all truth, all knowledge, all wisdom, but it was always tempered by grace and love and mercy. And we see it play out actually in John chapter 8. We see fully accountable, full truth, but also full of grace. When he meets the woman that was said to be caught in adultery, right at the end of that story, after the accusers walk away, Jesus tells the lady, he said, where are your accusers? Neither do I condemn you. So that's the grace. But then he looks at her and says, but go and leave your life of sin. Don't sin anymore. That's the truth. And we have to have be full of grace and full of truth. So the Corinthian church, they came to this idea that a non-existent God could not contaminate food, but the weaker Christians just couldn't get their minds wrapped around that. They weren't at that place yet. They had not matured yet. So sometimes being logical is not, being logical is fine, but you have to make sure that your logic is tempered by love. Moving on, verse 5. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. Here's what he's saying. He's not saying that there are any other gods other than the one true God. He's saying that we treat a lot of things like gods. Other people claim that there's other gods, and we turn a lot of things because our propensity as humans is towards idolatry, is towards worship of created things. He said we turn a lot of things. A lot of us, we turn sports into a god. We turn our kids into gods. We turn our car into a god. We turn our house into a god. We turn our bank account into a god. So there's tons of things that he says that we call, these are so-called gods. And there's many lords, meaning there's many things that we're giving our lives to that have control over us. Yet for us, there's only one God, the Father, from whom all the things came, and for whom we live, and where there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came, and whom we live. And so Paul is making this point. Yes, food sacrificed to an idol is not to a false god is not contaminated, because that false god actually doesn't exist, because we know that there's only one true God. But that didn't take away the question and the conflict. So now he's going to show these Corinthian believers, this is what you're supposed to do in this situation where logic needs to be tempered by love. Here's what it looks like. Verse 7. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. So listen, not everyone's where you're at. So be humble in your knowledge. Some people are still accustomed to idols. When they eat sacrificial food, they think of it having been sacrificed to a god, and their conscience is weak and defiled. But food does not bring us near God. We are no worse if we do not eat it, and no better if we do. So a lot of the people in the first century church were coming out of these pagan religions where they were used to eating these feasts dedicated to idols. And so they just couldn't fathom getting back into that lifestyle after God had set them free from it. So although they had the knowledge of the one true God, they weren't at a place yet where their conscience would allow them to partake. And that introduces a new concept into Paul's writing here for us, where he starts talking about not just logic and love, but he's also talking about this internal compass that we have called the conscience. And he says that for these weaker Christians, their conscience is weak and defiled, meaning it's just not what it would be, because our conscience is always dependent upon knowledge. So when you're a new believer, your internal conscience that helps you know right from wrong, the things that I should do, the things that I shouldn't do, it's not quite fine-tuned like it will be 5 years into your relationship with Jesus, 10 years into your relationship with Jesus. And so when you're early on in your Christian faith, the best thing that you could do is make sure that you're getting this book into your heart. That way, what you're doing is you're fine-tuning that conscience. That way, as you go out, as you're living life, your heart is speaking to you. No, that's not right. You shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have approached that in this way. You shouldn't be doing that. That's not a good relationship for you. But the conscience is a muscle that has to be developed. It has to be fed knowledge so that then it can help you make decisions. See, the conscience is not the law. It's the witness to God's moral law. See, in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, God said he's going to write his law on our hearts. Our conscience helps us know that law, but we've got to put knowledge in for our conscience to actually work properly. Conscience depends on knowledge, and so the more spiritual knowledge we have, the more fine-tuned our conscience will be. You want to know right from wrong, you got to make a daily discipline of listening and reading to God's word. So he goes on from there, verse 9, he says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights. So Paul says we have Christian liberty. Within our salvation, we do have freedom. We have what is called, like I said, Christian liberty. And he said, in your exercising of your rights, make sure that it doesn't become a stumbling block to the weak. So there are certain things in God's word that are very black and white. They are very, like, they're non-negotiable. Like, you can't say, well, I don't see it that way. I don't think that that's wrong. No, there's certain things that are super black and white. And then there's other things that our conscience, as it gets fine-tuned to what the Spirit wants of us, will lead us to abstain from things that others in the faith may not abstain from. And it'll also lead us to participate in some things that others in the faith may not. So there's these very concrete things in the scriptures that it's a non-negotiable for everyone. And then there's going to be what I would consider personal convictions about certain things. Some of you won't watch certain movies because that's your personal conviction the Lord has laid on you. Some of you won't go to certain restaurants, and some of you won't. You may have any number of different things that it's like, no, I understand that there's room within my Christian liberty for this, but my own conscience won't allow me to do that. And you don't want to sin against your conscience. You don't want to go against your conscience, because then you will feel bound up. In the Christian life, you were meant to feel free. And so it's easier to feel free whenever you're not fighting an internal battle against yourself. So that's why when your conscience says no, you need to say no. And when it says yes, it's okay to say yes, but there's going to be some very defined markers for everyone, and then there's going to be some that others add, and some that, I had a pastor growing up. He had major issues with alcohol, so therefore he would not go to any restaurant whatsoever that served alcohol. He didn't tell everyone else that it was wrong. He said, just for me, this is what the Lord's asked of me. There's going to be certain things that's going to be true of you. That for me, the Lord has asked me to abstain from this or that. That's where the conscience and God writing His law on your heart comes in to play. Verse 10, for if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't the person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? He's saying, here's the other responsibility of a strong, seasoned Christian, is you have to realize that the younger, weaker Christians are looking at you. They are taking an example from you. So are you setting a good example in front of them? Are you practicing your Christian liberties in a way that perhaps might be damaging to them because they're not where you're at? So for the weaker Christians, it wasn't a good idea for them to engage in eating the meat from the temples, because they just got saved out of that lifestyle. A very good example of this would be when it comes to the topic of alcohol in the church, which has always been a really controversial issue in the church. There's nothing in Scripture, from what I can tell, that would prohibit someone from having a drink. There is clear prohibition against getting drunk. Now, however, you have certain people in the church that feel, man, this is my personal conviction. I shouldn't have anything to drink whatsoever. We have other people that's like, I don't mind practicing my Christian liberty in this way. But to this point, if you're a recovering alcoholic, you probably shouldn't go to a bar. And that's what Paul's saying. It's like these people are recovering from pagan idolatry and pagan worship. They probably shouldn't go back to the very temple that they were just saved out of. So therefore, you stronger Christians, you need to realize that the younger ones are looking to you. The weaker ones are looking to you to take their cues. And you need to make sure that you exercise your Christian liberty in a way that's not going to be a stumbling block for them. That's not going to cause them hardship. Verse 11. So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. He's saying you can destroy weaker Christians' walk with the Lord through your own actions if you're not careful how you exercise your Christian liberty. Verse 12, when you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So as the stronger, more mature Christians, when you're not careful of how you live in front of weaker, newer Christians, he's saying you could actually be sinning against them by not being more careful in your conduct before them. Yes, you may have Christian liberty, but you do not have Christian liberty to tear down somebody else and to affect their walk with the Lord. This is why we have to walk very wisely in this life. We may know a lot, but remember it has to be tempered by love for everyone around us. Verse 13, therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I'll never eat meat again. so that I will not cause them to fall. Here's what Paul finishes the chapter with. He says, listen, if me in my Christian liberty causes another brother or sister to fall, well, then I just won't do it. I just won't go there anymore, because I'd rather put their needs, their spiritual journey ahead of my own Christian liberties. This is where we before me comes in. This is where let them get the Husson's and Gino's pizza, and it's just pizza, just eat it, okay? We before me, Paul's saying, listen, if it's between them stumbling and them falling back in their relationship with the Lord, I'll just tell myself no, and you ought to as well. This is the way that the church should function. The stronger Christians should be discipling the newer Christians. The more seasoned saints should be finding new believers to disciple. And as you are in that relationship, you have to live wisely to make sure that you don't cause them to stumble. You put their needs ahead of your own needs when it comes to exercising your Christian liberty. And so that's what's going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul's saying, listen, if you want the church to function as it was meant to function, you need to put the needs of others before yourself. Yes, you have Christian liberty, but inside of that Christian liberty, inside of that area, you have to realize that there is a world watching you. There are younger Christians watching you. They are taking their cues from you, and you need to live wisely before them. You may have a good reason for the things that you do, but that knowledge has to be tempered by love for others. I know we don't do a lot of the whole meat sacrifice to idols and things. That's not really a modern issue that we have here in the West. But I will tell you, one of the issues we have in the West is knowledge not being tempered by love. I'll challenge you right here. Whenever you're about to make another Facebook post or tweet something or share something, make a comment, make sure your knowledge is tempered by love. Especially if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, it's what's expected of you. Don't impugn the name of Christ by poor behavior out on the internet with a whole bunch of knowledge and not enough love. Don't let that be you. Make sure you put others before yourself. That's what Paul's talking to us about tonight. That's my challenge to you this week. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. I hope that this was a blessing. I hope that this helped move you forward in your walk with Christ and your understanding of His Word. If you want to build that conscience up, get into this Word every single day. I hope that you have a fantastic week. We will see you this weekend.